Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this streamed workshop hosted by the Tulsa chapter of the American Guild of Organists. My name is Joseph Arndt, and I'm privileged to serve as the dean of this chapter and also to be music director here at St. John's Episcopal Church, where we are providing this stream. Today, we're going to enjoy a talk on organ tonal design by my colleague Adam Pajan, who teaches organ at OU, amongst other things. And at OU, he also teaches courses in organ technology and design. So I think you're in for a real treat. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Adam Pajan.
Thank you. Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here and to talk about organ tonal design because this is something that I just inherently love. One of the great joys of getting to go out and play in different places is experiencing different instruments. And of course, that's the best way to learn is by going out and experiencing, and you certainly figure out what things are successful and what things maybe are less successful, and then are always, at least I find myself being constantly surprised by things that I don't expect to find that I do, or things that I expect to find and don't. So surprised both pleasantly and sometimes curiously. So first I just want to ask, we've got just a small number of folks here who are distanced, but I want to ask you all who are here, how many of you have been involved in an organ project at some point? I know that Susan just did at Boston Avenue, and at Michael you have here. If you haven't, most organists will be involved in an organ project of some kind in the course of their career, whether it be a brand new instrument, whether it be restoration or a renovation, additions. There are so many different ways, right, that we can be involved in one, but it is enormous responsibility on our parts too, because if we're working for a church, and today I'm specifically talking about sort of mainline church instruments, to try to put some kind of governor on it, because we could really sort of go down a rabbit hole, right? So concert hall organs, symphony hall organs, are all very different, or have some of the same basic components, but may take us in a very different direction. And since most of us are doing work in the church and will have an organ project in the church before we will have the opportunity to design the next Meyerson organ, I figure we'll talk sort of about mainline church work. So you have to have some baseline of knowledge about this before you endeavor in such a project, because aside from the building itself, a pipe organ is almost always the next largest investment a congregation will ever make. So this is a lot of responsibility that's on your shoulders. You could be committing $1 million or more of people's money toward a project, and although at the end of the day, people will usually forget the cost of an instrument. 10 years from now, they're not going to remember the dollars and cents you spent on it. They're just going to know whether or not you have a really beautiful instrument that is supporting the congregational singing, that's accompanying the anthems well, that's playing the repertoire. They're going to know either it excites and it moves them, or it doesn't. And so that's a lot of responsibility on our parts when we're entering into the design process. So I would say one of the first things is don't come in with an, I have to have an X. I was recounting a little bit earlier, I was shadowing a consultation for a potential organ in a major city in the South, and there was a church member who was, I would say, an amateur organ person, and that's not meant to be disparaging, meaning just not doing his career as an organ builder, who had a lot of interest in seeing this instrument come to fruition. But he started out with an, I have to have an oboe d'amore. First of all, I'm not even exactly sure what that means. We can pull out the Irwin Dictionary of Organ Stops and look it up. But I'm not entirely sure what that means. So I also titled this lecture, I Need a Rohrschalmei, because when this Schoenstein Opus 173 was being designed, initially I was engaging with Joseph in the tonal design process, but after an initial sketch had already been done, and the only reed in the choir that was a color reed was a Rohrschalmei, and I said, but Joseph, there's no clarinet on the organ, and he said, but I want something to do Baroque music. And I was like, all right, but we're in a mainline Anglican church, Episcopal Church. That's an indispensable color. So with a little bit of poking and prodding, we have now a corno di basso, which is a clarinet family stop. And I'll also say that I'm sure it would have been beautiful, but we'll get to sort of what happens with reeds. But what do you choose and why? I have to have an X. Well, let's talk about what we really fundamentally need to have present before we start to talk about what our preferences can be. And to that end, we shouldn't eliminate some of our own preferences from a design, right? We don't want to just iron something out and have a form. We want to have something that also is a representation of ourselves and of our vision for what an instrument can and should be. And that's not a bad thing. So, another question is, what makes an organ sound good? Is it the specification? Potentially. There is certainly a certain amount of what stops are in an instrument that make it sound good. But furthermore, what's the scaling of the pipes? How are they voiced? What are the acoustical properties of the room? How has the builder considered those factors when scaling and voicing the pipes? So it's not only what you see on paper that makes an instrument good, right? And also what's in a name. Well, stops can say anything they want on them, but you know, as they say, was the proof's in the pudding, right? When you pull on the stop and start playing and you realize that thing that says this really doesn't make that sound at all. So paper, looking at things on paper specifications can give you some indication of what to expect, but the only thing, of course, that'll really tell you is getting into the instrument, is playing it, is listening and really scrutinizing the sounds with keen ears. So I'm also curious, if you went over to the console and saw that there's an 8-foot flugelhorn in the choir, could you climb into the chamber and go find the 8-foot flugelhorn? Joseph's raising his hand. Yes, good. I'm glad you can. So I think we also need to have some amount of knowledge about how stops are constructed, because if something ciphers, we at least need to be able to know what a gedeckt looks like. So instead of just going and putting your hand over top of every pipe, if there are 2,000 of them, it could take you a really long time to figure out which one is making the sound, right? If you know that a gedeckt is a stopped flute, and if you know that the one in the grate is metal and that the grate is over here, well, then you've got a pretty good idea of where you're going to start looking to try to find that particular stop. So I think, again, some responsibility to know what we're going to be putting into it and what kind of sound also that it's going to generate. So we always need to advocate for quality respective of style. I talk about this a lot. It's true in terms of styles of music. It's true in styles of organ building. Don't simply just genuflect at the name of Skinner and spit at the name of Schlicker, or vice versa, because there are some really wonderful EM Skinners. Skinner didn't bat 1,000, right? They're not all beautiful, and they're not all, well, I shouldn't say beautiful, they're not all remarkable. And the same thing is true of take whatever builder you want. I just use Schlicker as an antithesis because they're stylistically so different. There are really, really wonderful Schlickers. There are ones that are less successful as well. So let's always talk about why something is of the highest quality and hopefully put some real defining characteristics behind it that we can identify as saying it is successful because of these features. In the same way as we talk about music, right? Because, you know, Vidor 6 is a fantastic symphony. How many of you know Vidor 1? Oh, good, a couple of hands. I don't. I think that, you know, we find the things that are really fine within a composer's output, and we perform them, unless you're like Duraflay, where you have a very small output and it's all solid gold, personal opinion. But for those composers who did write a huge body of music, not all of it rises to the very top of the quality chart. So always look for quality respective of style. Neo-Baroque instruments, for example, aren't necessarily my first preference in terms of aesthetic. If I could choose an instrument to play on a weekly basis, I would, well, I get to play here. I'm very fortunate. I would rather go to a Schoenstein than a Neo-Baroque mechanical action instrument. That's just a personal bent. I also have played Beckerats that I thought were utterly beautiful and every bit as satisfying as playing the Schoenstein here. So quality respective of style. Good. Don't make an organ project your own pet project. That's why they have Hauptwerk. You can put whatever funny specification you want together on the computer, dial it up, and have it ready to go. I know of a church an Episcopal church, where a musician really wanted a French classic style organ. And so a respected builder built a really fantastic and beautiful French classic organ with period style pedal board, short notes and everything to play the Episcopal church. It did not last very long in the church before it was removed because it simply didn't meet the needs of the congregation. So don't get too wrapped up in your own personal desires before you really take a step back and say, what's my community? It's the same thing we talked about with hymn playing. Know your people. What's the community? What role is this instrument going to have? What does it need to do? And if we're talking about mainline churches, it needs to accompany congregational hymns. It needs to accompany choral music. And then way down the list, it needs to be able to play some amount of the repertoire and hopefully with some amount of faithfulness to the style. But that's really a far lower consideration than whether or not it's going to be able to accompany the opening hymn on Sunday morning. So make sure that you are thinking about the needs of the instrument and the needs of the community before you get too specific in the having an oboe d'amore in the choir division. We can't approach a project with the idea of, well, I have to have 44 stops because St. So-and-so's 3 blocks over has 43 stops. So I need to have one more stop so that it's big. Let's dispense with the size wars or with your concept of I have to have all of this. Let's leave that really to your professionals. So you have to trust your builder. Get a builder that you really trust and have a great working relationship with, and they'll tell you what can fit and what's practical to fit and what's going to make it most successful. I heard an organ builder once talk about how much instrument to put in a given chamber, and he said, pipes are something like the voice, where if you have your hands over, it sounds like this, but if you allow space, it opens up and develops. So he advocated for less pipes in the chamber, as opposed to that one extra stop that he thought that all of them would speak more freely if there were more space. I think it's certainly a worthy consideration. And while we have just a brief moment of aside when we're talking about how much organ in a room, always invest in the room first, right? You've heard hopefully the saying that the room is the most important stop on the organ. So if you can make improvements in your acoustical properties of your room, you will need less organ to be just as successful in that room. So the better scenario you have for the instrument to speak into, the less of it you need, and the more successful it will always be. So we're going to have fun later when we have, at least I think it's fun, we're going to do a specification by committee. So we'll pick 20 or 25 stops, and then after we go through this, and I'll ask you all, tell me what needs to be in this. And it's always fun, especially I do this with the students, and somebody says, oh, but well, there needs to be a larigo. And okay, great, but how about a principal in the grate first? So I always enjoy seeing where people's priorities are, especially the first 10 stops seem to be pretty easy to put together, maybe 15, and then those last 4 or 5 is where really the rubber hits the road, and you've got to start making tough decisions because we are almost always limited by budget and by space. And it's very rare that you have all the space in the world for everything you want and the budget to accomplish it. So we're always in the point of having to make some really difficult decisions. So, speaking of making decisions and how to talk about tone, we have to talk first about the Harmonic Series, because everything about tone is going to be governed by the Harmonic Series, and that's when we're combining sounds, when we're talking about what it's ultimately going to sound like, it's driven by the harmonic. So we know that the Harmonic Series is a naturally occurring phenomenon, that there are certain pitches that are present in any given sound, and it's what gives it its specific characteristic sound. So we're going to start here with C. So we're going to call this our fundamental. And I know that this might be a little small to read. So we also number our harmonics. So the first harmonic is the fundamental. Sometimes this gets a little bit confusing. So in terms of the number, this is the first harmonic is the fundamental. The next harmonic is the octave. Then we have a fifth, the next octave, third, fifth, and then we start getting up into the area where it's really a sort of a flat seventh, and then the octave again on top of that. Have you all seen this before? If not, maybe it's a good refresher. You can, and we can see this proven, right? If you've got a string, and you move your finger along the string, right? It separates it out, and you can start to get into that harmonics. Or if you've got a natural horn, and you change your embouchure, you continue to flip up through these various harmonics. Amazing to think that, say, Baroque trumpets, right, are playing primarily with harmonics and not vowels with natural horn. That just blows my mind. Major respect to people. I just go up and play a key. They're doing a lot of manipulation to make that sound. So anytime that we're talking about tone, we're having to talk about the balance of harmonics. This should look like something else to you too if you're thinking about a division. 8, 4, 2 2/3, 2, 1 3/5, 1 1/3, 1 1/7, 1. So the cornet, when we're pulling out 8, 4, 2 2/3, 2, 1 3/5, all it is putting a specific stop at every level of the harmonic series. So we're just building a complex sound that is already naturally occurring within each one of those notes, which is really interesting, I think. And then of course, the harmonic series continues far above this level, and we also know that there are harmonics that are outside of the normal audible level, but those harmonics still have an influence on the sound of any given pipe, for example. A student at OU several years ago did a technology project where he sampled, did a recording of pipes and of very high quality digital reproduction from a digital organ builder, and analyzed the harmonic spectrum. And this one particular organ builder, I think, has really successful digital sounds because they reproduce harmonics outside of the audible hearing level, which actually graft very closely to the pipe itself, and not all do. They think, well, it's outside the audible level, it's not going to exert an influence on the sound. Not necessarily true. Okay, so let's get back to organ building. There are, broadly speaking, two categories of stop tone, right? Two kinds of construction. There's flue and reed. Now, flue is the broad term, and we're going to get a little more specific here in a second, but they're very different styles of basic construction. Flue pipes are like whistles, right? They're like the diapasons. There's a mouth at the bottom. There's a flue or a slit, right, where the airstream issues from as it comes up through the toe, and then the body of the pipe, the air molecules inside it move and resonate, and that's what causes the sound to be produced. Whereas in reed pipes, they are lingual. They have a tongue, right? So we've got a brass tongue that's curved, and it fits across an open tube, a shallot, a brass tube, and there's a part of that shallot face that's cut away, and the vibration of the curved brass tongue against that brass-faced shallot is what causes the sound to generate inside the pipe. So two basic styles of construction. Within flues, there are principals flutes, and strings. So as we know, principals are the backbone sound of the organ. They are the core component. They are the only sound in the organ that isn't imitating some other kind of sound. So it's our own unique, particular kind of sound. Of course, it's what we normally see in the facade, and it really is the foundation on which everything else is built. Flutes become a little bit more diverse because there are so many different styles of construction of flute. So let's talk about them here briefly. We have stopped, half-stopped, open, and harmonic. Let's take just a second to unpack some of this and what it means. We're going to be talking about harmonics here through this whole discussion. So, pardon. Stopped flutes are just as they sound. So imagine you've got a body of a pipe and you put a cap on the top of it. It causes the pitch to drop an octave. So stopped flutes are half length of their actual speaking length, right? And so to take just one step back as a point of clarification, the number that we see on the draw knob, if it says 8, it means that in an open pipe, the lowest C of that stop is approximately 8 feet long, right? There's some wiggle room based on the scale, but we'll not split too many hairs about that. So in a stopped flute, bottom C of an 8-foot rank is only 4 feet long, which is great for saving space. It does come at a cost, though. We lose the even-numbered harmonics in a stopped flute. So if we think back to, I could flip it back over, but let's just talk about it. The fundamental, if we're talking about a C, is the note itself, right? So the first harmonic is the fundamental. The second harmonic is the octave above it. And then the next harmonic above that is the fifth. So when we're listening to a stopped flute, especially in the bass, it loses some of its pitch clarity because it doesn't have the first octave there to help reinforce the fundamental and give us a really clear pitch. But Borden's, Gedek's names for stop flutes are also very characteristic sounds and absolutely essential. So that's not to say that they're not good. They're just, you need to understand what exactly is going to happen with the harmonics in a stopped flute. In a half-stopped flute, other names for half-stopped are roar, you see, or chimney, or roar flute. So, I worked with Fred Barr for several years at OU, who was a really fine voicer. And he had, I think, the best way of describing a chimney flute or a half-stopped flute is that imagine you've got a stopped flute that's got that canister on the top, and then there's a little, what looks like a chimney, a little tube that extends off the top of it. It can also go internally, but more often out of the top, and it's open at the top of that little chimney. So he said, I like to think about it that it's a stopped flute that has just a tiny little open flute on top of it. So what happens when we do that is it starts to open up some of the upper harmonics. It still is a half-length stop, so we aren't going to get that second fundamental, just like we have lost in the stopped flute, but it gets a little bit more color and a little bit more vibrancy, and I think they're really beautiful. Just not at 4-foot pitch. That's kind of a joke with my students. Open flutes have the full harmonic spectrum included in them. So they are like a principal, but they're larger. And we'll talk about scale here in just a moment of what that means. So the full harmonic content is available in open flutes. Most oftentimes we see them at 4-foot pitch, particularly like in the swell. You'll see flute octavient or something of that nature. We've got an open flute, and we can afford to do it at 4-foot pitch because it takes up less space, because then all of a sudden it's only the same length as the bottom of the 8-foot Borden if you have it there. Harmonic, anytime we see the word harmonic attached to something, it means double length. And what that does is it strengthens the presence of the fundamental and gives a stop more power. We can thank Cavalier Cole for making harmonic flutes standard practice in his instruments. And in fact, the idea of having a harmonic flute chorus in the swell, like at 8, 4, and 2, is an idea that comes from Cavalier Cole. And we don't normally see stops. We might say when they go harmonic, which means at what point in the range do they go double length? Because if you have an 8-foot harmonic flute, imagine if you had it harmonic all the way down to the bottom, you would have a 16-foot stop in the chamber producing 8-foot pitch. Most of us, going back to space and money, have neither of those things to provide for a harmonic flute at the bottom. So we normally start with open pipes, and somewhere around middle C or so, give or take, depending on the division and the specific builder's design, is at the point at which it would go harmonic. It would be double the length. And so then what happens is the pipe is too long, so we drill a hole at the acoustical node, which there's a ratio that's 0.45 or so, the length from the flue to the top of the pipe. And so it causes it to speak its its second harmonic, which is the octave. So it's speaking the pitch that we want to achieve from it, but the resonating body is double the length. When we're deciding how to mix flutes together, we normally think about starting with the most stopped and going to the most open as you ascend through the pitch. So it would be far more common to have a stopped flute, a Borden or a gedeckt, and then a 4-foot chimney flute and a 2-foot open flute than to do it the other way around. Also, if you think about stopped flutes, if you have a stopped flute at 2-foot pitch, which is half the length, it's only a foot long at bottom C, which means by the time you get to the top, they're so small that we've transitioned probably into open pipes because it gets to be virtually impossible to voice a consistent speech out of a pipe that's a resonating length is only an inch or so, or less. Flutes come in all different styles of construction, as we talked in this regard, but then also in terms of material. They can be made out of wood and they can be made out of metal. There is some amount of debate as to how much influence the material in a pipe influences its tone. Certainly wood versus metal, there is a difference, but within different kinds of metal, there's some amount of debate. I was told that there was an American Institute of Organ Builders lecture at a convention where they brought in a voicing jack and put up a screen so that you couldn't see, and they had the same foot and mouth, and then they added different resonating bodies on top of it to try to see how much influence the type of material exerted on the tone. And I think that everybody voted that the one that they liked the most was the cardboard tube. So within different kinds of metal, there's not always necessarily this gives this gives that. There's something, tin makes strings sound more silvery, or if you have copper resonators for this or that, that's maybe getting down a little bit of a rabbit hole, but I'm not sure that there's quite as much influence, and of course, my professional colleagues are happy to disagree with me. Great, let's go on to strings. So the strings are the poor little guys that I think get left out the most, right? We know that we need to have the core of principles and flutes, but the strings add another really important component to broadening the color palette from which we can choose. I think we're really fortunate to have 2 sets of strings and celestes on this instrument, and they're different in scale, which gives them a different kind of color. So we know that a celeste, right, is a rank that is built in similar to its parent, but it's tuned sharp 98% of the time. There are instances of flat celestes. I remember there's a muted viol celeste in Wolsey Hall, and reportedly Skinner said that it just sounded sad. And people also have the misunderstanding that when they see Dulciana and Undamaris, right, that's a typical sort of pairing of a quiet string with a celeste, that unter means under, so it's got to be tuned flat. Most of the time is not true, and celestes are almost always more successful if the celesting rank is tuned a little bit sharp. And so when we combine those together, it gives us that undulating sound. Imagine that you've got an orchestra playing, and all of the first violins are not going to have their vibrato happening at the exact same speed, right? So otherwise we could just put on a tremolo with a single stop and try to approximate the sound. But they're always moving just a little bit out of pitch with one another, out of tune, and that's what causes that really rich, warm sound, and we can approximate the same thing. Okay, now over to reeds. Reeds have as many different shapes of resonators as you can imagine. So with flue pipes, we're talking about just essentially one big piece. Reeds are in two pieces, essentially. We've got what we'd call like the motor, right? So it's in the boot, and that contains the tongue, the shallot, the wedge, things that hold together, the tuning wire, and that we can really separate in terms of our thinking from the resonator, which is then the body of the pipe itself. There are two basic shapes of resonators. There are conical, which flare outward, and then there are cylindrical, which essentially look like a normal flue pipe. They just don't have a mouth on them. Chorus reeds are the ones that are often played together in an ensemble as opposed to a solo reed. Chorus reeds are almost always, not unequivocally, conical. So we think about anything in the trumpet family, oboes, and oboes can kind of play a both-and role, right? They can play a solo role, but they're also, I think, indispensable in terms of filling out the chorus, especially, Franck. You can't play Franck without the foundations and the oboe, and his oboe we know was of a mild enough color that it really coalesced with the foundations. Color reeds tend to be cylindrical, but not always. One thing that we can definitely say is that the clarinet family stops are cylindrical, and they are also half-length. It's just part of what imparts that very characteristic sound. The same thing is true, say, of vox humanas that are cylindrical, but they can come then in different lengths. So we don't always have to have a full length. I just said the clarinet family stops are half-length. Vox humanas are sometimes as much as 1/8 length, where bottom C is only 1 foot long. As you might imagine, when you change the length of the resonator, you're changing the harmonic spectrum that's present inside the pipe. So the shorter the resonator, the more upper harmonics and the less fundamental. The longer the resonator, the more fundamental, and that doesn't mean that you're losing the upper harmonics, but it's about the strengthening of the fundamental. And yes, we can have harmonic reeds also, where the resonator is double the length of the pitch that the pipe is speaking, and it does the same thing as it does with harmonic flutes. It just serves to strengthen the fundamental even more. Now, the pitch that a reed produces is really all governed by the boot. What's happening inside that motor? The thickness and length of the tongue and the size of the shallot. So we can put an 8-foot C resonator with a boot with a 4-foot long resonator on it and still get 8-foot pitch, because it's what's happening down in the boot is generating that tone. However, as you can imagine, with a shorter resonator, we're going to lose some of the fundamental and get more harmonics. We often see this in most cases with half-length 16 or 32-foot reeds, again, because of space. You're in a swell division, there's not enough room or height for there to be a 16-foot reed, but we can have an 8-foot resonator on that 16-foot C. So we'll still get the pitch, we're just gonna lose some of the impact of the full harmonic spectrum. We can also cap reeds like we can flutes, but it does not serve the same purpose of dropping the pitch by an octave, right? Because again, everything's happening in the boot. So you can have an oboe that gets a cap put on top of it. What do you think that does to the harmonic spectrum? Sort of mutes some of the upper harmonics, and so it makes it a little darker and a little bit richer and serves to sort of warm up and support the fundamental. There is a lot of nomenclature that can, again, we talked about what's in a name, sometimes very little, but that can indicate the kind of sound that you're going to get. So if you see trumpet spelled Trompette versus cornopian, you're imagining that the trompette is probably going to be a little brighter and have a little bit more harmonic content, and the cornopian is probably going to be a little bit darker and a little bit more fundamentally rich. If you see bombard versus posauna, you're going to assume that the bombard, again, is going to be a little bit brighter, a little bit harmonically rich, and the posauna is going to be a little bit darker and a little bit rounder sound. So we also can do our job by trying to pick the most accurate names to describe what's on the stop. Now, there's something over in here that I didn't talk about, and that's hybrids. And so hybrids are a tapered stop. So as opposed to a principal being just a straight cylindrical body, tapered pipes move in toward the top. And so you can think about it in the same way the harmonics, the upper harmonics, start to get muted a little bit. But they're sort of neither here nor there. They fit somewhere in between. So stops like the Gemshorn or flauto dolce, for example, are tapered stops. They can come in all different kinds of scales, and the amount of taper can vary. Maybe it tapers by only 50% of its original diameter. Maybe it tapers even more than that, and that's going to influence the kind of sound that it creates. Anytime you see the word spitz, S-P-I-T-Z, appended to something, it means tapered. So if you see spitz gamba, spitz viol, spitz flute, they're going to be tapered, and it's going to mute some of those harmonics. So let's talk briefly about scale, because I mentioned that several times. A scale is a descriptor of a pipe's diameter respective to its height. So there was a German in the 19th century, Töpfer, who went around and measured principles in a lot of different organs in Germany and came up with this idea of Normalmensur. There will be a quiz at the end. And so this was the normal measure of a pipe. And he determined that at 8 foot C, most principals that sounded characteristically like a principal had a diameter of 155.5 millimeters. And that there was 17th halving. What in the heck does that mean? Early on in medieval instruments, when they were just starting to discover some of these characteristics of sound, they would build pipes that all had the same diameter. Well, you can imagine that the kind of tone changed quite a bit through the compass. If you have the same diameter and a different length of a resonating body, it's going to have an effect on its tone. So what Töpfer determined from visiting with these different instruments is that for any stop to keep its own characteristic sound, the diameter needed to be half every 17th pipe. And so that's why a principal sounds more or less like a principal through the entirety of its range, is that every 17th note is half the diameter of its respective original note. And that is variable, right? The builders have used different halving ratios, we call them. Sometimes it'd be 16th halving, sometimes it might be 18th halving, where we just change just how much it changes its diameter in different registers, and we can accomplish some very specific effects because of that. So, when we're talking about the scale of flue pipes, flutes are the broadest, principals are in the center, and strings are the most narrow. And of course, within each of these categories, there's a lot of variety, right? So principal scales, so he called Normalmensur, this 155.5 millimeters, he called this a 44 scale. And he came up with this determination by saying, if scale 1 is 1 meter wide, and we continue with this idea of 17th halving, the 44th note would be 155.5 millimeters, which is how I came up with this idea of 44. So if we say a scale 44 principle, it's the sort of basic principal sound that you can expect to find when you go to any instrument, pull on the great 8-foot, it's going to have roughly that sort of tone. But we know within principles you can do much smaller scales. Sometimes you'll see Geigen principle, if you or come across that, or horn diapason. That usually means that they're slotted at the top, and that opens up some of the harmonic spectrum. That tend to be a little smaller in scale. Or you might go to a late 19th century, early 20th century instrument with a big solo division that has a stentorphone, and that usually means a massive scaled principle. So we've got a lot of variety within each of these categories. Same thing is true of strings. Normally if you see something like gamba, you expect it's going to be a little bit keener, a little bit brighter sound. If you see something like viola pomposa, it really is almost sitting between principal and string tone in terms of its scale. It's a little bit broader, a little bit warmer. It's what I've heard called a church string before, and that it's a really versatile kind of sound, but that it's not quite as specific. Keeping an eye on my time. Okay. How are we going to pick divisions? Now the rubber's going to hit the road. We're going to start designing our instrument, and we need to determine, is it going to be great, swell, choir, solo, positif? What does that mean? What do they typically indicate? Well, I think we can pretty much all agree that there's going to be a great of some kind, and then some secondary manual at least. In most cases, there are, of course, one manual instruments. The secondary manual, I think most oftentimes, is going to be the swell. But there are cases where an instrument might be more historically informed, and there's a main division of a great, and then a positive or a rückpositiv, rück meaning behind, right? So that's the one that's mounted on the side of the balcony rail. Typically would then not be enclosed. But I think most often, right, we're going to have a great and a swell, and at least the swell is under expression. Beyond that, you may have a choir, you may have a positif instead, and that sort of depends on what your bent is. It's interesting to note, brief aside, that choir comes from the English chair organ, and the chair organ was so named because it was literally a small division that was like underneath the bench. It was their own small rückpositiv. So even in English instruments from the early 20th century, choir divisions are almost never under expression because they're still in the style of a chair or of a positiv. So the idea of an enclosed choir division is really an American concept, not a British concept. I prefer as many things under expression as possible. That's a purely personal bias, but I want to be able to have as much control on the pipes as possible to make them as versatile as possible. There are people who will argue that a pipe speaks better when it's not enclosed because there's nothing impeding its sound. You know, they say, well, the swell shades are open, but there's still shades that are blocking some of its tonal egress, which isn't entirely wrong. But I think that the flexibility that comes with enclosure is well worth the end that we're going to accomplish with it. Briefly, let's talk about the balance of divisions. I think that in general, we think that the great, well, I don't know, should the great and the swell be the same power, or should the swell be quieter than the great? Or should the swell be softer than the great? I don't think there isn't a specific right answer, but it's worth considering. So do we want the great and the swell to be on the same plane, or do we want it to be great larger and swell quieter? Or do we want to invert that and have the swell be more powerful than the great? For example, small Skinner instruments of the earlier part of the 20th century, if he was limited, he would often put only a few stops in the great and then have a massive swell division under expression. I think in our instrument here, that the great and swell are fairly close in terms of power. The swell probably being a bit more powerful yet than the great. It's under expression, so we can pull back that dynamic. And then so we're probably here, or maybe with the swell being just a bit more powerful. And then I would say the choir is probably farther down here because it contains more delicate stops. Not necessarily always the case, and again, there's no right answer about that, but as you're starting to design your instrument, you do need to think about where you want the power to be held and why. Okay, a final thing before we start talking about the actual stops themselves. Give your organist, and yourself, primary colors. If you mix red and blue together, you get purple, right? Okay, don't start with purple, because then we don't have the red and the blue from which to draw. So it's always better to give yourself stops, give yourself a principle, give it a flute. Don't start with a hybrid stop, because then we're losing some of that really elemental material that we need to be able to build our own colors. And we can then set up even a greater diversity of fundamental colors, which enables you to mix them however you like. So the very first thing that we need to talk about, principles. You've got to have a principal chorus of some variety, right? And when we talk about chorus, we mean essentially 8, 4, 2, ending with the mixture. We're going to come back to mixtures in just a second. At least that amount as the main backbone of the great division. And secondarily, if you have the space and the money for it, having another principal chorus available in a secondary division, I think, is a really, really great value. We saw a lot in sort of the second half of the 20th century, the idea that we could use a borden and a viol or a viola, a broader string, together, because we're sort of splitting the difference on either side and creating a principal-like sound. But it's fine to be able to mix colors that way, and that's a really useful sound, but if at all possible, even in a secondary division, put a principal there, because again, it's our tone. It's the one that we get to claim and say, haha, organ tone. And it really is the foundation on which we're building everything else. Then we can start to mix in flute colors. But as we said earlier, think about using different styles of construction, starting with more stopped and going to more open. So I would not encourage having a borden in the grate and a gedeckt in the swell. They're both stopped flutes. Now, if one's metal and one's wood, then that gives you a variety of colors, so at least there's a little bit more give and take there. But otherwise, have an open flute somewhere. A concert flute is an open wood flute that goes harmonic, usually, or a melodia that's an open wood flute, or just an open metal flute. Here's a case where you can sort of usher in the Spitz flute as a hybrid, but still being more open will give you a variety of color there. Strings. When we're getting to strings, let's put in some honest-to-goodness strings. I'm certainly an advocate for that. What we might call keen, more keen strings that have that thinner, slightly more edgy harmonic tone behind them, rather than starting with the viola pomposa, which is that sort of broader, somewhere in between principal and string. Let's really give it an honest-to-goodness gamba or a solitional or something that's got that kind of rosin edge on it. Because, again, with that more fundamental color, we can mix in the strings with the flute and warm up the sound and start to give it some variety. Now, here, as I said, we're really fortunate. We've got a set of gambas in the swell. We've got a set of dulciana and undamaris in the choir. So there's a totally different kind of tone that's being produced by those, and especially when you combine them, you can get some really beautiful effects. Okay. We can also make some really nice effects by giving hybrids a celeste. If you ever see flauto dolce, or like a 2-rank flauto dolce tucked away in the swell somewhere, they're usually really, really quiet, wispy little stops. They are tapered, pretty strongly tapered, and they celeste really beautifully. The things that don't celeste well are stopped flutes. And I'm not sure exactly why it is, if it's because that the second harmonic isn't present, if it just makes it difficult for them to find that kind of consonance together, but stopped flutes are rarely successful, rarely, not exclusively, but rarely successful as celesting ranks, usually full length. Principal celestes are less common, though you do see them, and you would normally see that marked as a voce umana. That's a carryover from Baroque Italy, where that was a very characteristic, and they normally started around middle C, and if you listen to elevation toccatas, for example, of Frescobaldi, and you hear this very broad, warm, and undulating sound, that's the principle in the voce umana. It's something that has been more or less left in history, though there are certainly very fine examples of them that are still being built. Now, we've gotten to the top of the chorus. We've got our 8/4/2 principles, and then we're going to put a mixture on top. What the heck is a mixture anyways? It squeals, right? No. The Roman numeral on the stop indicates how many ranks are present within it. And in modern building, I'd say, again, 95, if not more % of the time, we're talking only about unison and fifth sounding ranks. There are examples, especially from the earlier part of the 20th century, in Romantic organ building, where we would get third sounding rank tierce mixtures, or even sometimes including up to the flat seventh, the septième. The more harmonics we add of those upper partials, the more reed-like the tone becomes, because reeds are very rich in harmonic spectrum. So when we include the third and seventh sounding ranks in some of those mixtures, they start to sound kind of reedy by themselves, which then starts to cross that threshold of giving us the difference of color between principal chorus and reed chorus. So I like to be able to have a tierce that you can add into a mixture, but prefer just unison and fifth sounding ranks, because I think it gives us that crystalline clarity that we really anticipate coming from a mixture. If you've ever seen one on a chest, they sort of go like this. They come down, and then the length goes up, and then it goes down and comes up. Those are breaks, because if we're starting, let's say we have a 2-foot based mixture of 4 ranks. That means that it's going to be 2, 1 1/3, 1, and 2/3. Those will be the pitch levels that are included. So if we're at a 2/3 foot at bottom C, and we go up an octave, those pipes are getting pretty small. There's no way we can possibly go all the way to the top of the range, because the pipes would just be too short to sound and out of our audible range anyways. So we have breaks, meaning that we go up a certain amount in the range, and then the pipes drop back 1. So the 2 becomes a 2 2/3, and the 1 1/3 becomes a 2, and so on. So they're each just kind of dropping back by 1 next of the pitch level. So whereas the unison becomes the next lowest fifth, the fifth becomes the next lowest unison. And so that's how we're able to keep them from getting to be too small and too high-pitched. You may also see progressive mixtures, where it says something like 3 to 4, for example. And in that case, it means that there's obviously a variable number of ranks in that stop. So it may start at 3 ranks in the bass. When it gets into maybe tenor C for the next 3 octaves, the main part of where you're playing most of your music in those middle 3 octaves, then it expands to 4 ranks to give you more harmonic richness, and then drops back down to only 3 ranks at the top, so that it's not quite so high-pitched. In general, I prefer having an even number of ranks in a mixture, so that we're always getting a balance between the unison and the fifth. When we get into 3 and 5 rank mixtures, then when we get to certain breaks, there might be 2 fifth sounding ranks and only 1 unison, which I think then gives it, again, that more of a reedy kind of sound, and I prefer to have that sort of balance. However, the magic is in the scaling and in the voicing. So if you've got a 3 rank mixture that is fifth, unison, fifth, and the fifths are scaled a little bit smaller so that they're a little bit more mild, it can be utterly successful. It's not to say that that's a rule by any means, but when you've got an even number of ranks in the mixture, it just helps balance the presence of fifths and unisons. Now, what about the pitch of the mixtures? If we've got a chorus of 8, 4, and 2, do we need the mixture to be at 2-foot pitch? You certainly could do that. Or you could make the mixture 1 1/3 foot pitch, which would be the next fifth above that. If it is based at 2-foot pitch, you give yourself the opportunity to draw 8/4 mixture, because the 2 foot's present in the mixture, or you can add the 2 foot to that to give more clarity or more presence at that pitch level. And I wanted to bring up that word clarity. I think it's a real misnomer, a misunderstanding to say mixtures add clarity. Well, actually, I think clarity comes from beautifully voiced pipes. If you've got an 8-foot principal that's rich in harmonics and well-voiced, it's just as clear as anything. So don't get caught up in these sort of misnomers that you have to have really high-pitched mixtures in order to have any amount of clarity. In fact, sometimes it can do the opposite and give you less clarity. When you're deciding what 16-foot stops to put in the manuals, please don't put in a quintadina. Quintadinas are not the manual double for the great. Now, in a secondary division, absolutely, you can use it to great advantage. But we really need something that's got more harmonic spectrum. So if at all possible, if you've got the height and the space, put in a 16-foot violone, for example, which is kind of somewhere between principal and string tone, or a double open diapason, something that gives us richness. Even better yet, a stop flute, a Borden would be better. The thing about a quintadina, not to pick on it too much, but it's so called because the fundamental and the first harmonic, naturally occurring harmonic, are voiced of roughly equal power. Now, it's stopped, so it's missing that even numbered harmonic. So the first naturally occurring harmonic is the 12th, quint, right? So that's where the name quintadina comes from. So the fundamental and the 12th are voiced at roughly the same power. Unfortunately, when we need a manual double stop, a 16-foot, we need something that's got a little bit more weight and gravity behind it. So in the great division, a violone or a double open diapason, if at all possible, you can make other concessions as necessary. If you're on an electro-pneumatic or all electromechanical, direct electric is the Wix term for that, right? Style of action. Make all of your 16s playable in the pedal, please. 16s take up so much space, and they cost a lot of money. So if they're going to be in the swell, make that swell Borden play in the pedal. Make your choir Dulciana play in the pedal. It's only going to give you more tools and more resources. If the mechanical components are in place to make that possible, it adds virtually nothing in terms of cost, and it can only add to the amount of flexibility that you have in the instrument. Mutations. Those are those ones with the fractions on them, right? So they are, as we talked earlier, just specific parts of the harmonic spectrum that are given their own stop. If you see a mutation stop with a name on it that is, say, like Nazard or Tierce or Larigot, those are usually flute scale pipes. And if you see one with an intervallic name on it, 17th, 19th, 12th, those are principal scaled pipes. So we would normally find those more in the great, for example, than you would in a subsequent division, because it can then be mixed into the chorus. If you ever see sesquialtera, it's 2 ranks. It's the 2 2/3, the 1 3/5, and their principal scale. If you see cornet with, say, 3 ranks, it's probably the 2 2/3, 2, 1 3/5, the upper partials, and their flute scale. When you're designing, try to put the mutations, the flute scale mutations, opposite the division that has the clarinet family stop in it. Because if you want to play your French classic music, you need a cornet on one hand and a crumhorn in the other. And so if they're both in the same division, you're stuck. Now, reeds. We talked about trumpets, oboes are the kind of the chorus reeds. They're forming the backbone. Then the next most common color is the the clarinet. So if you can only have 3 reed stops, trumpet, oboe, clarinet. If you can only get 2 of those, you have to start making a decision about which one isn't going to be able to fit in. And that's why 25 stop organs are really fun to design, because you've got to start making some difficult decisions. If you've got space for it, put in a vox humana. It's a very characteristic sound. It doesn't take up a ton of space. I think they're really beautiful. And when they're mixed with the strings, they just provide a warmth and a color in the ensemble that just can't be replicated. Don't start with your tuba. Don't come in and say, oh, there's got to be a chamade on the front, and then you realize that you haven't put in a clarinet yet. Also, don't put in a clarinet chamade. But make sure that we're being logical about our choices. Again, don't jump to the oboe d'amore before you have a principal in the great. In the swell is often where we find the reed chorus, right? At 16/8, maybe with 4. And in as much as possible, give the 16 some real weight. I prefer something like a double trumpet or a contraffigato to like a double oboe, which to me just never quite has enough presence to be really satisfying. Okay, so, sir.
On the stream, somebody asked about a double melodia like Roosevelt used to do.
Sure, so a melodia is an open wood flute, but interesting because normally when we're looking at the construction of a wood flute, right? So here I can't draw. I'm just going to put that out there. My students know this. They always make fun of me. I was told in 3rd grade art that my bird looked more like a flying pig by the teacher. And ever since then, I've given up any hope of ever being able to draw anything. So excuse me on that. But normally when we're looking at a wood flute, we're looking at the front of it here, and the mouth is cut backwards toward the front of the pipe. Melodias are different in that the mouths are actually cut onto the inside of the pipe. So as opposed to, so it looks, right, that it's shaved away on the inside. Golly, I'm not doing a very good job of depicting that. Normally, right, with the mouth, coming in this way, for melodias, they're cut back inward. So yeah, a double melodia would be an open 16-foot stop within the flute category. We would normally find something like a Borden more often, again, because of space constraints. But that, yeah, certainly can be a very useful addition. There are a lot of stops that have come and gone in history and have been sort of forgotten, like the choralophone, for example, or the aeoline, if you've ever seen. The aeoline is normally the softest stop on the organ. It's this tiny whisper of a string that you can sort of hear when the box is open, and when it's shut, it vanishes into eternity, which is part of the beauty of it, is that it's a very specific kind of color that can be very effective. So, now that you're experts in all things tonal design, let's build an organ. We've got enough time. So let's, for the sake of brevity here, let's say 20 stops. I keep saying 25, but let's go to 20 stops because that'll put us a little bit more of premium on what exactly we're picking. And for our sake, we're going to again consider a mainline church that doesn't have a very specific sort of bent toward contemporary or toward Baroque, so we're going to be playing standard hymns, anthem accompaniments, etc. Let's also, for our sake here, just decide that we're going to have some kind of electro-pneumatic action. It could be electric slider chest, it could be the Pittman chest, what have you, just so that it gives us some flexibility in terms of borrowing things. We could really limit it if we wanted to go mechanical action, which is also fun. So, I think we can all agree that there needs to be a grate division and a pedal. What do we want as our secondary manual division?
Swell.
Swell, excellent choice. Do we want the swell to be under expression?
Yes.
Almost always is, I agree. Do we want the grate to be under expression? Okay, I agree, but again, flexibility, but not everyone would. And in fact, I'm going to make a recommendation here in just a second. So we're going to say that the grate is under expression also. All right, 20 stops, throw them at me.
8-foot principle.
8-foot principle in the grate. Now, here's going to be my one recommendation. Let's make it unenclosed. Let's make just that one stop of the grate, the rich backbone of the whole chorus, sitting out in the open, and we'll consider that maybe it's going to be in our facade. Okay, one stop. Rohrschalmei. No, you don't get a Rohrschalmei. You still don't get a Rohrschalmei. Well, we talked about backbone components, right? We need a chorus in the grate.
4-foot principle.
4-foot principle, excellent. Why don't we call it octave? 2.
2-foot principle.
2-foot principle.
15.
We'll call it super octave. Josh, am I getting too low?
Nope,
Excellent, thanks. Okay. An 8-foot board in where?
Great.
In the grate, okay?
Well, I would say in the swell.
See, already we're on stop 4, and we're already going, well, actually, does it go here or does it go there? Let's put it in close. Let's put it up in the swell. We'll call it Borden. Now, I'm going to make the suggestion here because I said that we're going to use some kind of electropneumatic action. When we're counting stops, if we have an extension, you understand an extension is just an octave added on either the upper or lower side. We don't count it as a separate stop. It gets counted within the same stop. So I'm going to go ahead and just lobby out here that we should have a 16-foot Borden also, and we'll call the 8-foot an extension, so that way we're not losing one of our stops, but we've got at least a double available down there. Okay, we're up to 4.
Let's borrow the 16-foot Borden in the pedal.
Yeah, absolutely. Great choice. Coming down from the swell. All right.
Gamba and Celeste.
Okay, good. Let's put a string in Celeste in the swell. And he says, Gamba, I'm on board with that. We'll call it Voix Celeste. Okay, we've got 6.
A 4-foot control as well.
Yeah, sure. Because we can certainly use the Borden and maybe with the Gamba with that 4-foot, we're going to create that mini chorus in the swell again. In an instrument of this size, we might not have the luxury to have a second principal up here. So that's a great decision. Let's add 4-foot principal.
Let's do an 8-foot reed in the grate.
8-foot reed in the grate, okay? Hold that thought. I think we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves in terms of some of the other things that we need to have, but we will eventually. The question's going to be which of those 3 and how do we make that determination?
Maybe a harmonic flute in the grate.
So yeah, some sort of flute in the grate. We often see harmonic flutes because they serve as such beautiful solo voices, and the most common opposing or accompanying stop for a harmonic flute is the Celeste. So putting it in the division opposite the Celeste makes a lot of sense. So let's do that. Okay. We're at 8. Should we give the pedal its own 16-foot stop? I think it needs something. Most common 16-foot is a sub-bass, so some sort of Borden. I know we've already got a Borden, but since we're not sure about our size, let's go ahead and assume that there's going to be a sub-bass in the pedal. Now, I'm also going to extend it up to 8. This is part of what Skinner called the augmented pedal, where he would build a diapason that would play at 32, 16, 8, and 4. And he wouldn't do that in the manuals, but justified it in the pedal by saying, in the manuals, we're playing contrapuntal music, we're playing several notes in close range. In the pedal, we almost never play more than one note at a time. I shouldn't say almost, but rarely do we play more than one note at a time. We're not going to miss having that note there.
Wouldn't the scaling be bigger too in those? I mean, proportionately.
In the augmented pedal?
Yeah.
Not necessarily. Not necessarily. You would just need to be an appropriate pedal scale. There are, well, that's a debate best had another time, which is, do you have augmented pedal or not? But yeah, I mean, you would still want to have very careful scaling practices. Anytime you extend a stop, it's going to be playing at 2 octaves, right? So playing at an 8-foot pitch and playing at 4-foot pitch, you normally don't want them to be exactly the same strength. So you've got to be very careful about the scaling and voicing. All right, we're at 9.
Like an 8-foot principal in the pedal.
Okay, good. That's another question of whether or not do you have it or not. I agree. Okay. We don't have a mixture anywhere yet. We don't have a 4-foot flute in the swell, and we have no reeds. And we're halfway through. This is hard.
Well, let's have a 4-rank mixture in the grate.
Okay, a 4-rank mixture in the grate. We can do that. We'll call it forniture. What pitch do we want it to be? 1 1/3. So that way we can draw 8 4 2, and then the forniture, the mixture is the next step up. Great. 11.
Of trumpet and swell.
Okay. So now we're going to get to the question which you came back to a reed in the great. Do we want our trumpet in the swell or do we want it in the great?
Swell.
Swell. Okay. All right. We can agree on that then.
I think we also want an oboe in the swell.
Okay. We'll go ahead and put it in. We'll see if we can sustain it.
Would an extension of the trumpet borrowed in the pedal be feasible?
It might be, although I would rather advocate for an independent pedal reed. So let's hang on and see if we can make that possible. By the way, we haven't talked about this, but let's just say that the pedal is going to be expressive with the great division, just for the sake of clarity, because we know if they're otherwise under expression. Okay, good. So now we have a chorus in the great. We've got strings in the swell. We've got a couple of reeds. We've got 7 more stops that we can add here. How about a 4-foot flute in the swell? Okay, let's say harmonic flute. By the way, while I'm saying harmonic flute, if you see octavin, O-C-T-A-V-I-N, it is a harmonic 2-foot flute. It is not a principal. So don't pull the octavin on with the mixture, because 2-foot harmonic flutes and 2-foot mixture pipes like to do this with each other. So keep the chorus clear and leave the 2-foot flute out of the chorus. Also, I'm going to lobby an opinion here. 1 2-foot flute and an organ is plenty. I don't use 2-foot flutes hardly ever at all. It doesn't mean that they're not useful, but I think that you can get a lot more bang for your buck by introducing a different color.
Would a resultant be considered an additional stop?
Nope. Nope. We can add the resultant down here. So, right, a resultant plays the fundamental pitch and it plays a fifth above it to give a resulting tone that tries to suggest that it's 32. You usually, if at all possible, want the fifth sounding to be quieter than the fundamental, because we still want to drive the bass of the pitch. So in this instance, we would probably pull the 16-foot from the sub bass and the fifth, the 10 2/3, from the Borden, since it would be ostensibly a bit quieter. Okay, 6 more stops. Anything else in the great? We've got a chorus and a harmonic flute, but that's it.
What about the clarinet?
Okay, this is the case where I think we can justify putting the clarinet in the great. Five more stops. Do we want a double anything in the great, or are we going to leave our double only in the swell? Do we want a 4-foot flute in the great? Do we want mutations somewhere? We don't have any mutations yet. Do we want a different string? A solitional? Let's say, if we're going to do that, let's call it, let's say viola. Something that's maybe just a little bit more broad, but it has this, because we've already got a rather keen string in the swell, let's do something with a slightly broader scale in the great, so we've got some more contrast. 4 more.
10 2/3 and 1 3/5 in the swell.
In the swell, put mutations in the swell. Yeah. Now, do you want them independent, 2 independent stops, or do you want them as like cornet 2 rank? I'm sorry?
Independent.
Independent, okay. So, we'll call these Nazard. Oops, I didn't give myself quite enough room. We'll do it this way. And so you need a 2-foot in there also? Okay. Let's call it, let's just do it. Octavin.
Maybe another mixture.
4-foot octave in the pedal.
We have no 16-foot reed yet. Do we need one in the pedal?
Yeah.
Okay, well, this is our last stop.
I I'd like one in the pedal.
16-foot reed in the pedal?
I think so.
Okay. And because we're going to have some flexibility, let's just say here that we're going to do a 4-foot super octave, and we'll extend the pedal 8. And let's just call this double trumpet. And we'll extend that up to 8 foot. And that's it. Now, notice that we only have one mixture in this instrument, and it's in the grate. We could have made some other concessions to enable it to have another mixture in the swell, which, by the way, we almost always see in America, or very commonly, a plongeau. It has nothing to do with a historical French plongeau at all. It's an English quint chorus mixture, which is fine, but it's somehow we got the idea that if we call it plongeau, it makes it French swell, because we have to have a French swell reeds, and it's a bit of a misunderstanding.
On the stream, somebody asked about extending the 8-foot viola and the grate to 16 and then adding in pedals.
Sure. I mean, now we're getting into a question of budget, right? Whether or not the budget will actually allow for that. And so, but I love that idea. So let's call this, we'll just call it viola. And then we can go ahead and put it in the pedal over here. Well, it would, yeah. And in this case, too, while we're being a little bit free with what our concessions are, even though I said don't do it, let's extend the oboe down to 16. Now, the reason I could advocate for that here, it would give us a different color that we would borrow into the pedal, since we have a double trumpet in the pedal. And since we've got another 16-foot member in the swell, and we're in an otherwise small-ish instrument, that I think can be justified. Otherwise, I would still find it to be a stronger case to give a rich double trumpet sound there. So here you go. It's not easy to make these decisions when you only have 20 stops. If we went another 5 stops, I think that we would find ourselves getting a little bit more variety in the grate, because right now the grate is really just a chorus division. But if you can only put a mixture in one place, I strongly advocate put it in the grate, because then that's the completion of the core of what we've already got. So any thoughts or reactions? I think this stuff is wildly fun. It's always interesting to do this by committee. Believe it or not, this looks an awful lot like what happens in class most times. But when we get a little bit beyond this, it's really interesting to see how thoughts change, and to see how my own thinking changes as time progresses about what the priorities really need to be. And again, how is it going to support the congregation? I think that you can easily say that this has enough 8-foot tone. That's the last thing I think I want to close on. Give your instruments lots of 8-foots, because people sing at 8-foot pitch, right? There's a reason that the orchestra has 30 violins and 1 piccolo and not the other way around. So give yourselves several 8-foots to pick from before you have 3 mixtures, because it really is just following the general principle of the orchestra, of the choir, of the band, right? Anything that we're always got to think about that unison tone, and especially for singing, that's the foundation on which everything else is built. Thank you very much.